Hello, this is an interview for Cast in Stone, and my name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you introduce yourself, Dr.
Yes, my
Tincknell?
name is Estella Tincknell. I'm Associate Professor in Film and Culture at the University of the West of England, and I'm also a former Bristol City Councillor and Deputy Mayor, sometime Deputy Mayor.
Marvellous. Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Tincknell. The purpose of our interview is to talk about the contestation of the statue of Colston and statues in its vicinity. Would you please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol? What brought it to your attention?
Well, what really brought it to my attention as a city councillor was the famous Colston toppling. That's not to say that I wasn't aware of the statue and indeed its somewhat contentious history up until that point. But it is true to say that it had gone down the political agenda to some extent. So at this point in time, I had been deputy mayor to Marvin Rees, who, as you're probably aware, is the first city mayor in Europe of mixed race heritage, African Caribbean heritage, and also kind of white British. And Marvin is also a Bristolian, very proud of his city, but fully aware from his own complex experience growing up a kind of working class mixed race boy of the way in which Bristol works as a city, which is, on the one hand, it appears to be a very kind of liberal, tolerant, easygoing kind of a place. On the other hand, there are kind of entrenched power structures and vested interests in Bristol, which often prevent things from changing very much, although they may appear to do so on the surface. So we have been aware that there have been debates and discussions about the future of the Colston statue for several years, from really the kind of 1990s onwards, when various figures, people like Madge Dresser, for example, who was an erstwhile colleague of mine at the University of West of England, and Madge had been very proactive in kind of challenging the narrative around Colston. But I have to confess that I had not paid it the attention I should have done, really, until the moment of the toppling. And of course, that came in the wake of the George Floyd scandal in America. There's a very kind of a sense of raised consciousness about the experiences of Black people in Bristol, especially, which I had always been aware of, but this increased my awareness that something needed to be done. And I regret that the City Council didn't do enough up until that point. But there is a story behind that, which, if I may, I'll say something about.
Yes, I'd be interested for you to tell me that story. In just a moment, you mentioned that the statue was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest. What specifically Black voices had or have been raised in contestation of the statue of Edward Colston? What have those Black voices said or been saying?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, my experience was it was often white voices which were speaking about it on behalf of a Black community, which I think is deeply problematic. There were undoubtedly sections of the Black community in Bristol who were uncomfortable with the Colston statue, but also there are sections who regarded the toppling as a kind of form of gesture politics by kind of white radicals who didn't necessarily understand the kind of longer term history of the experience of being part of a minority ethnic community in Bristol. And I suppose that's what I mean by some of the really kind of complex narratives around this. But undoubtedly voices had been raised in the past, and there have been debates and discussions about what should be done about the statue. But and indeed it was proposed that it should be removed or moved or something done about it. But what had happened was an attempt at compromise, and a rather feeble compromise at that. So there had been discussions in about 2018, I think, between Marvin Rees and those who had erected the statue. And as you probably know, this is not erected by the City Council. So although public monuments are nearly always regarded as in some ways either the property of or responsibility of city councils or municipal authorities, the odd thing is that not every monument of that kind is actually erected by municipal authorities. They come about by complex histories. And so one of the problems, I think, was that the city council's hands were to some extent tied insofar as responsibility for the statue appeared to be in some ways unclear. So whose job was it to decide to remove it? But I have no doubt at all that there was a certain degree of foot dragging because of the contested nature of the figure who's on the statue, whose statue it is, which, if you'd like me to, I'll kind of explain to you a bit about that, and the role of Edward Colston in Bristol's history.
Well, please then do tell me, who does this statue represent, and what did this person do in history, and how did you learn about that?
Well, if you grew up in and around Bristol in the 1970s and 1980s, as I did, you would know of Edward Colston because primarily of the Colston Hall, which was Bristol's main concert hall, really, throughout that period. Built in the 19th century, magnificent Italianate-style building. By the time I was going there, it was all a bit shabby. But it was the one venue in Bristol where kind of moderate to major bands would play. I mean, people like the Beatles played it. I think Jimi Hendrix played it. Everyone played the Colston Hall, okay? And it was also the place where you went for Christmas concerts, sometimes school performances. So it actually has quite a significant role in Bristol's history. If you grew up as a school child in history, chances are you would have gone to the Colston Hall at some point in your life. And if truth be told, most people didn't think very much about its name. Partly because it's on Colston Street, and partly because there are lots of other Colston named spaces, places and monuments around the city. Why is this? Well, Edward Colston was, as we learned as a child, he was effectively a philanthropist and benefactor, and he was one of the merchant venturers. Now, the merchant venturers were a kind of Freemasonry of wealthy Bristol citizens who have been going since at least the 16th century, long before that, I think. As their name suggests, their money derived from mercantile capitalism, from trading around the various parts of the world, including, of course, the West Indies and the Americas. And Colston was one of these figures. Now, as a consequence of the wealth that he amassed from trading, he had endowed a number of schools and charitable institutions in Bristol, including things like almshouses. As far as Bristol school children were concerned then, Edward Colston was a benefactor, and that was what we were told. And this was especially true if you attended one of Colston's schools. You were encouraged to be very proud of the fact. They are still kind of quite prestigious schools. There is a kind of irony that the ambitious parents of children from ethnic minority groups in the city want their child to go to Colston's because it's a route to a successful academic career, supposedly. So there are lots and lots of contradictions around this. It is not by no means a straightforward narrative, okay? So fast forward to, shall we say, the 21st century, and the origins of Colston's wealth are beginning to be more widely known, and there's a degree of discomfort around it. Of course, Bristol also, more widely as a city, had built its wealth on trade primarily with the West Indies, and of course Bristol's main manufacturing industries were based on that, since they came from sugar, chocolate and tobacco. And as a consequence, Bristol has some really rather lovely 18th century houses, Georgian houses, which were built by the merchants. You may remember David Olusoga's wonderful programme, A House Through Time, in which he actually explored an example of one of those houses. I live in Clifton, which is, again, a contradiction, isn't it? It's sort of paradox. I actually live in a 19th century house, but just up the road to Clifton Village, where you've got those wonderful Georgian terraces. Who lived there? Well, it was primarily the merchants and traders who had amassed their wealth one way or another from certain forms of trade with the Americas and the West Indies. I'm not saying they're all slave traders, but to a large extent there would have been a degree of slave trading involved probably in the amassing of that wealth. So the Colston narrative is one in which the figure of Edward Colston, up until the 20th century, the dominant narrative was that he was primarily a wealthy benefactor, and the statue, as you probably know, was erected in the late 19th century, even though Colston had died sort of almost 200 years before and had no monument to him. My understanding is the statue was partly erected as a kind of answer to a statue of Edmund Burke, which had been erected a few years before. And Burke had been, as you probably know, a major 18th century statesman, and had also been quite a vocal anti-slavery and abolitionist figure. The Colston statue came about partly perhaps as a riposte to that, I don't know, but it was also part of a more general beautification of the city in the late 19th century. You do find this in many major cities actually, including London, really fascinating. Things like Buckingham Palace being refronted in the early 20th century so that it looks appropriately imperial as opposed to a rather sort of miserable townhouse. So you're finding this happening in other major metropolitan cities throughout the United Kingdom. Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, they're all building their major town halls during this period. So this kind of monumentalism, which is part of the kind of imperialist discourse during this period, and Bristol is no exception. So to some extent, the statue is part of a retrospective beautification of Bristol and kind of monumentalisation of what was seen as leading figures. So it's not erected during or after his immediate lifetime, it's erected quite a long time afterwards. And the other interesting thing about this is not erected by the city council or its equivalent. It was erected by public subscription. And I can't remember the name of the man who set up this subscription. You can look it up on Wikipedia, actually. But this was, I believe he was a merchant venturer. And the intention was that the general public, the populace of Bristol, would all subscribe. But apparently not that many people put forward any money. So they had to kind of put the money together from the wealthier citizens. So the public narrative became that this was a sort of response to popular demand, that the people of Bristol wanted to commemorate Colston. In actual fact, again, it's a much more kind of complicated partial story than that.
This is very helpful, Dr. Tincknell. Thank you.
Is it? Oh, good.
You mentioned that from your perspective, the statue of Edmund Burke, which is nearby, or is now nearby, the statue of Colston, had a relationship with the later statue of Colston. But the statue of Colston was an answer to or riposte to.
Well, that's my understanding.
Could you tell me where you might have got that understanding?
I don't know much more about that, but Professor Tim Cole, who chairs the History Commission, I believe had mentioned it, and I picked that up when we were having a conversation about the history of the statue, and I thought that was very interesting. If you're going to interview Professor Cole, which I would recommend, then you can pick up that narrative with him, because I don't know very much more about it than that. But it certainly it has a plausibility to it, I think, either in the somewhat dubious interest of political balance, or indeed because people were anxious about Colston's reputation and the kind of reputation he might gain. It seems to me that it's, as I say, there's a kind of credibility to that narrative. But I'm not a historian by trade, so I don't know the full background to it.
Thank you. This is very helpful. So you mentioned the History Commission. So when did the question of the statue's future in public space first arise for the City Council? And where did the request for consultation and a commission come from?
Well, the issue of the contested nature of the statue had already arisen 2017, 2018, as I said, and Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, had been in negotiation for a rewording of the plaque to better reflect Colston's role as a slave trader, rather than the wording which existed at that point in time, which simply commemorated his philanthropy for the people of Bristol. Now, for some reason, that was put on the back burner. I don't remember the reasons for this exactly, but bear in mind that for someone like the mayor of Bristol, there are all sorts of majorly pressing issues. The question of the arena was a massive issue during that time. So during this period, Marvin was embroiled in a whole series of issues around whether Bristol was going to have an arena. Needless to say, Bristol, as is wont, okay, every other major city in the country builds an arena in the early 2000s. Bristol doesn't. It finally gets around to thinking about it around about 2015, by which time perhaps the demand for arenas is shifting and changing. But nonetheless, this was a major public building, which had been heavily promoted by the local press. And George Ferguson, who had been Marvin's predecessor as mayor of Bristol, has sort of committed to building the arena. But as you probably know, these kind of major public works take about a decade to come to fruition. It's, you know, finding a site, finding the funding, which certainly can't come out of council coffers. It nearly always involves some kind of contract with, you know, other sources of funding. Anyway, at this point in time, the site which had been identified by George Ferguson in the centre of Bristol, what was called Arena Island, was proving to be quite problematic. So at that point, Marvin was busily embroiled in a decision to move the site to another site north of Bristol, which is outside the city boundary, which was itself contentious. It's no longer in Bristol. It's no longer adjacent to the main railway station at Temple Meads. So those sorts of issues were occupying a lot of his time. And although the Colston statue was undoubtedly symbolically important, at that point, it had kind of moved on to the back burner as well, something we need to do something about, but we're in an impasse. What do we do? And I think Marvin himself would say that his job was to govern the whole of the city, not just for particular interest groups. And while there was a lot of pressure to do something, that only came from particular quarters. It was not a general pressure from throughout the city. You know, we're not talking about massive demonstrations, really. You know, there were some very vocal concerns, but we're not talking kind of mass demand that something was done about that statue at that point in time.
Before we then go on to the History Commission, you mentioned that a number of people were brought into conversation about a rewording or a writing of an additional plaque, and that those who were raising their voices may have been loud but were particular. Who might have been the particular groups who were raising their voice prior to
I'm just trying to think, and I can't think of a name for you, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry. I'll need to check it out. It partly because I suppose I was a city councillor for Lockleys at the time, and Lockleys is a northern working class suburb of Bristol, historically primarily white working class. It's changed quite a bit in the last few years, but at no time during my time as a councillor did someone come and knock on my door and say, "Oi, what are you doing about the Colston statue then?" You know, what they asked me about was housing, health, policing, crime. Antisocial behaviour, youth facilities. Those were the immediate interests and concerns of the people there. So for me too, the issue of the Colston statue also became a sort of secondary issue. And maybe that was wrong. I mean, I had the culture brief at the time, and certainly in the strategy that we developed, there was a commitment to making access to culture much more inclusive, democratized and open to all the citizens of Bristol. That had been my primary concern during that period. Public monuments, interestingly, were not under my brief.
Whose brief in the council were they under?
Well, planning.
Oh, okay.
So I was in a very strange position whereby I'd come in to be deputy mayor with a very strong commitment to transforming the narrative of the city and the kind of cultural consciousness of the city. You know, I take as my kind of model Raymond Williams, you know, my concept of how culture works, you know, and I was determined to not bring culture to the masses in the sense of opening up high culture to everybody, although that might have been part of it, but to find ways in which we recognise the creativity and the extraordinary ability of people across the whole city. And as you may be aware that Bristol is a very segregated city for complicated reasons. So having lived in Birmingham, which is so much more integrated, it's amazing when you get there. You really notice the difference. If you arrive at Bristol, what you will mainly see at Temple Meads is white people, white middle class people. And that's true in terms of the way in which people live in the city, but it's also exacerbated by poor public transport, which means people can't cross the city very much. They can get in and out of the city centre, but what you can't do is get across the city. So you do find that regardless of issues of ethnic identity, that communities are often quite isolated as well. And you know, Lockleys is kind of, when you got there, you'd think it was miles from the city centre. It was only a few miles from the centre, but like people didn't go into the city, you know. It's like they were kind of living in isolation, you know. And there was a sort of resentment as well about, oh well, what are they doing to our city? So that's the other
Yes.
narrative that you need to be aware of in a way, which is the extent to which people are living on the kind of outskirts of Bristol in kind of primarily those sort of 1960s council estates or post-war council estates, who have been living through 10 years of austerity in which their everyday lives are becoming more and more challenging and difficult. For many of those people, worrying about a statue in a city centre was seen as a, pettifogging, as not particularly important. What are you going to do about buses?
Yes.
And so the class dimension to this, the socioeconomic issues around this, were also really important too. So getting that balance right, what is it you commit to, what is it you put all your energy into, is quite significant.
So when the council did make a decision to set up a commission, uh, what approach to that commission did the council take? How was the commission set up? What
So
was
this was
its
Marvin's
working
decision.
methodology?
So this is Marvin's decision as mayor. So because at that point, well, up until May 2024, we will still have a mayor, and the sovereignty of power lies in the hands of the mayor. It's a very autocratic system in very many ways. Autocratic, but with actually quite limited powers, because of course you don't control education, you don't control public transport very much. So it sounds as though you have more power than you really do. But within the limitations of power, it is the mayor's decision. So there is a separate mayoral office which operates to some degree at a bit of a distance from the other workings of the council, although obviously it is also linked to that. So the decision to respond to the toppling was Marvin's. And he decided that what we needed to do, but he didn't want to be the person to decide what to do himself. He wanted to put it in the hands of the commission, which was selected by Marvin, I think, members of his close circle. He sort of identified people he thought might be appropriate to ask if they would be prepared to serve on the commission. And that did include people like Maj Dresser and indeed David Olusoga, although David has since really sort of retreated from it. He's so in demand. He's got too many other competing concerns. So Tim was asked to chair it, and the commission consists of a range of people, a bit like me, not councillors, but people who have a sort of track record of interest in the way in which the city works. So that includes sort of historians, other academics, trade union leaders, for example, also city council officers working in the culture department who have a working knowledge of how we can actually practically implement some of the decisions that we're making.
And you also sat on this committee. Was this in your role as a city councillor or deputy mayor, or was this in your in another role? And what do you take to have been, or what expectations did you personally come to this commission with? And what do you take to have been your most significant contribution to the commission?
Well, I was asked to do it in my capacity as a university lecturer at UWE. And also one of my colleagues, Dr. Sean Sobers, is also on the commission. So there are representatives from Bristol University and from University of the West of England as well, in order to give a degree of sort of parity. Marvin asked me to do it because he knew I had that background in thinking about cultural questions, really. And he knew how keen I had been to effectively attempt to kind of transform the way in which the city's narrative was being, how it worked, really, how the city was talking about itself. And I think he thought that I could actually play a valuable role in challenging some of the assumptions, in putting forward some alternative ways of thinking about how we understand monuments, what we do with them, how we understand the kind of spatial geography and kind of the way in which geographies of a city tell a story. That they are not neutral, they're not innocent. And he knew that I understood that and wanted me to contribute that.
And for the record, what is your background in cultural concerns and issues? And
we're teaching cultural studies. So I have my master's in an MA in cultural studies from the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham. I since went on to teach undergraduate programs and postgraduate programs in cultural studies. So I've taught on MA programs, BA programs, and I also teach film and media studies. So I've got quite a broad understanding of the kind of intersectional relationship between the way in which kind of cultural geography works, but also kind of representation in its broadest sense. Not only representation in the sense of media representations, but how are people represented politically, how are they represented socially, how are they represented culturally. And that includes the way in which a city represents its people. Who gets to be monumentalized? What, whose statues are erected? What kinds of, street names do we give? And who's erased from that narrative as well? And this is a really important issue, is the issue of erasure.
And thank you for putting your finger up on that. And what do you take to have been your most important contribution to the Commission? Or maybe I should just repeat the other question. What were your expectations of the Commission, and what continue to be your expectations of the Commission? And what has been your most important contribution to it?
Well, hopefully working in a collegiate way with my colleagues on the Commission. As we've all got to know each other, I think we've found that we've worked to our strengths and each other's strengths. And I have been one of the very active members of the Commission, including contributing to the report that was written, for example. I've attended almost every meeting. I've been because I also have a background as a councillor, I know how the council works as well. And one of the things I was very keen to do was to ensure that the Commission did not just become a talking shop, in which we endlessly debated what to do about the statue and ended up doing not very much, or that we kind of kicked it into the long grass and hoped it would go away. I'm not suggesting the Commission would do that, but there can be a tendency for councils to do that when they are faced with really complicated issues which are not easily resolvable.
And
I really didn't. Sorry, go on.
Please do.
Well, we needed to keep them on their toes, really, and to set deadlines for responses and to make sure that the actions that we had recommended were genuinely actually being taken into consideration and things were happening. Because it's no good writing a report if it's simply filed away and then everyone says, oh, well, that's that sorted out then. We don't need to do anything more now because they've done a report on the toppling and we don't need to think about it again. There is a danger that councils do things like that,
I can imagine, and I can imagine how helpful it was for you to be on the Commission for that reason. What was the Legacy Steering Group, and what was the relationship between the We Are Bristol History Commission and the Legacy Steering Group?
Well, the Legacy Steering Group is chaired by Asher Craig, who is the other deputy mayor, but we've had a few mutual discussions, but interestingly enough we haven't had that many joint meetings, although there was a kind of intention to do so. The History Commission was charged with dealing with primarily the Colston statue, but also some of the kind of fallout of the Colston statue, if I can put it like that. As far as I understand it, the Legacy Steering Group has a slightly different mission to ours. And I think it was probably a good idea if you actually have a chat with Asher about how she sees that and where she thinks that's going. Because, as I say, although we had expected that we might work closely with them, as is the nature of commissions and committees, getting everyone together in a room or even online is always a challenge. And that was really one of the main reasons why we ended up saying, oh, well, we'd like to meet together, but somehow it was actually quite difficult to make that happen, especially given that most of the members of both commissions had full-time jobs elsewhere, other commitments. So we've tended to work relatively separately while also keeping in communication with each other.
You mentioned the Commission's final report to which you contributed. There was also a final report of something called Project Truth.
Yes.
What is or might be the relationship between those two reports?
They are not exactly the same. Project Truth is being conducted by Jo. Oh God, I've forgotten her surname. I knew you were going to ask me about this. Never mind. She's based at the University of Bristol. So there is an overlap between Project Truth and History Commission, but the two are not wholly aligned. And Project Truth is a slightly separate piece of research and work. So it's important not to kind of confuse the two. The History Commission is primarily a council commissioned grouping. Project Truth is slightly separate to that and is much more closely aligned to University of Bristol.
Okay. Thank you. Now, how do you, given your experiences of the commission, see the role of the local authority in managing public space? What do you see as the local authority's responsibility in shaping the space?
I think local authorities can have an extraordinarily creative role in shaping public spaces, actually. And one of the issues we have at the moment, though, is because it's often public spaces are created through planning in a piecemeal fashion. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have some kind of Haussmann style master plan for the whole city in which you knock down half of it and rebuild it. And although, of course, those things have happened in the past, especially during the post-war period, with the building of Broadmead, for example, which was kind of carved out of a much older network of roads. But I do think that councils should be mindful of the kind of emotional and cultural impact that spaces can create. And I think that in some ways Bristol has not been particularly attentive to that. And the attention, the kind of attention one needs to pay to the way in which public spaces generate community identity, enable people to come together, or prohibit them from participating in public events, or make people feel excluded from the city. I think those are incredibly important questions. The problem that we have is that what we think of as public spaces are not always owned, managed, or governed by councils. It's not unusual, for example, for ostensibly public squares to actually be spaces owned by private companies, especially if you're talking about kind of a financial sector. Often those spaces are actually owned and run by the company who owns the building, or a kind of holding company that actually owns the square footage, doesn't even own the building, and it may even be based in Hong Kong or Dubai. And you often come up against those problems.
So what cases of overlapping jurisdictional authority did you come across with regards to the Statue of Colston?
Well, the question of who put the statue up and whose responsibility it was to take it down, quite frankly. And that was a constant bone of contention. So although, an average member of public walking past the statue would assume that it was the City Council's responsibility, there were issues to do with the fact that it hadn't actually been erected by the City Council. The merchant venturers had a vested interest in it, and they're the ones who erected the plaque. But you also had English Heritage also had an interest in it because it was regarded as being of some value in terms of its kind of historical or architectural significance. So that added a further problem. And in fact, with the toppling, we were told, well, you can't just sort of put it away. This statue actually has a kind of cultural value, which has got nothing to do with who it's of and everything to do with who it's by. So those kinds of contested interests always come into play when it comes to the future of statues.
What were the recommendations of the local authority's legal department on what could be done?
I'm trying to remember, actually. I can't remember exactly. I just remember that there were lots and lots of debates about this, about what should, and of course, what you will find is that legal departments will tend to go for a conservative, a risk-averse solution. So we had to conserve it. Well, we had to conserve the statue. We had to make sure that it was, that it was it was not damaged any further. And also, of course, because it was seen as having some sort of historical value, then that meant that the council was responsible for it. We had to place it into a safe space in the museum to ensure that it couldn't be damaged any further, for example.
So you say you had to put it into a museum. Was this a decision that the commission took on the grounds of its the council's legal responsibilities, or was it a decision taken because this was called for from other quarters?
Well, it was. You may recall that initially it was put on its side as it had been toppled in a particular bit of a museum. The commissioner's job then was to decide what to do with it in the long-term future. So rather than us simply deciding what to do with it, we actually commissioned a citywide survey, and we had 14,000 respondents to the survey. So we worked very hard on the questionnaire, on the kind of questions we wanted to ask, which we didn't want to ask closed yes/no questions, but nor did we want to ask questions which simply permitted people to give endless possibilities which were not feasible. Given that the council had a responsibility for the statute, it had to do something practical with it. Asking open-ended questions means that you may well get people suggesting all sorts of things which are either financially, culturally, or legally impossible to do. So we asked a whole range of questions did people think it should be put back up in its former place on the plinth? Should it be given a special space in the museum? How should it be displayed? Should the history of the slave trade be a part of this? All of that was part of that. And really, the responses we got were that it should be on display, but it should be reframed. Those are the kind of majority of responses to this, but we should kind of reframe it, and certainly it should be recontextualized. And that was the decision that we took.
This is very interesting indeed. Who designed the survey, and who drafted the questions, and how many questions were there as part of this survey?
Gosh, I'm just trying to remember. The survey was designed by experts in questionnaire writing who are based at the City Council. Who you may be aware that councils constantly have to survey citizens these days. Consultation is a regular legal procedure you have to go through. So the commission was part of the conversation about that. We reviewed, refined, rewrote the survey a number of times. So there was extensive discussion about how we should frame the questions.
When you say we here, you mean the council or the commission?
No, the commission. So the employees of the council were sent away to basically come up with a first draft of a survey. That was brought to the commission. We debated and discussed it. They went away and did it again. I can't remember how many times, but there was extensive discussion about how we should phrase the questioning, how many questions we should actually put to people. You don't really want to put too many because it eventually becomes a chore, So I'm sorry, I've got the report here, and of course, needless to say, it doesn't say how many questions there were. Let me just see if it says at the back. Don't forget, this is a couple of years ago now.
True.
Yeah.
I guess the crunching of the raw data that you received and the analysis of that data and evaluation of it. Who conducted that work?
So there was data analysis conducted partly by City Council officers, but in collaboration with, basically the authors of the report, which is Tim Cole, Joe Birch-Brown, that's what I was thinking about, Edson Burton, Nigel Costley, Steve Paul, Sean Sobers, and myself. So there were others who were involved, including John Finch, who was the City Council culture lead at the time, a number of council officers, Ray Barnett, who is also the deputy culture officer, who was very active in the commission. So a whole range of people were involved in this, and it was a pretty thorough piece of work, actually. So not only were council officers and the commission very actively involved in shaping the way in which the survey worked, we were also very actively involved in the report and in effectively determining what kind of recommendations we were going to make once the survey had been analysed. So once the survey results were in, we had a number of meetings in which we looked at the survey data and then came to some conclusions as to what we were going to do with it.
The questionnaire itself and the raw data that you received as a result of the questionnaire, is that publicly available in the city archives, for instance?
Oh yes, I'm sure it would be. Yes, because you would be able to access it. Yes, because it's a public interest, so it's not secret by any means. I mean, what you might want to do is to get this report, which has a number of tables and pie charts giving you some of the statistical consequences or evidence that we that we came up with. But I'm
Okay.
sure that you can have a look at the questionnaire surveys as well. They will be
Yes.
archived.
So I've been in contact. I visited the Bristol archives, and they say that the data pertaining to the We Are Bristol History Commission hasn't yet been transferred to them.
Oh,
The
really?
project would be, yeah, Casting Stone would be really interested in having a look at the
Yeah,
raw data
yeah.
if it could be made available to us on.
Absolutely. Well, I can certainly
Um,
ask about that. I mean, it may be that these things take time. Given the slow progress that councils
of
often
course, of
make
course.
in doing things. But I guess you could do you could do a public information request, couldn't you? Actually, you can actually
Yes.
request that kind of information.
If you think that's the best way, we'll try that. But thank
Well,
you.
I mean, I see no reason why you shouldn't get access to it.
Yes.
It's not secret.
And also, there are some minutes of your commission's meetings prior to 2021, which are not available online. The ones after 2021 are.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um, would you recommend a freedom of information request for those, or is there another route I should take to obtain those, do you think?
I have no idea why they're not available. I guess you can try
Okay.
that. Yeah, I mean, but I think you should bear in mind this is a very sensitive issue,
Ah.
and it was very controversial in Bristol. So one of the
Mm,
things that we haven't really talked about was the public response to the toppling,
mm,
and it was I think actually Marvin handled it very well, because a significant minority of Bristolians weren't very happy about the toppling.
mhm,
They saw some people as having taken action into their own hands in ways which were seen as illicit, if not illegal. And as you know, 4 of the people who were actually involved in the toppling were prosecuted for criminal
mm.
damage. So the issue itself was a complicated one.
Who
And
initiated the prosecution of those 4 persons?
God,
Um,
I'm trying to remember.
what role did the council play in either the prosecution or in the trial of the so-called Colston Four?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just can't remember actually. Let me just have a look. It's the police actually, Avon and Somerset Police.
Hmm.
But who actually initiated that? I don't know.
And did the city council participate in the trial in any way?
I certainly didn't, and nor did
Hmm.
members of the commission.
Hmm. Um, I'm aware that we're approaching 12 o'clock, and I'm keen to finish on time. There are 2 burning questions I think I have to ask you, and I want to leave time for you to ask me any questions that you might wish to ask as well.
Mm.
Um, are you in contact with other local authorities, either nationally or internationally, or other commissions, such as the one in which you participated, that were taking similar steps?
I am not at a personal level, but I know that Joanna Birch Brown certainly is.
Hmm. Is that nationally or internationally?
Internationally.
Marvelous. And can you give me an idea of which locations in the world, or?
Certainly Citizen America.
Hmm.
So I think it's partly because her own background is as an American academic,
Hmm.
and she's been quite heavily involved in sort of truth and justice reconciliation. So I think that it's arisen out of her own research.
Hmm.
So it might be something you'd like to ask her about.
Marvelous, thank you. And you mentioned that you represented, as a councillor, an area that was, in its plurality or perhaps even predominantly racialized, and classed as white working class. Um, what sort of responses did the survey that the Commission engaged in receive, either from the specific area that you represent or from white people who might be racialized and classed as white working class more generally in Bristol?
Well, during the period I was a councillor there, Locklea's changed quite significantly. It's much more gentrified now than it used to be, and I certainly would not wish to depict it as somewhere which was strongly conscious of a kind of white racialized identity. It's more a kind of tacit consciousness, shall we say, if that's a way of putting it. Actually, the respondents who came from that ward were in favour of, broadly in favour of the statue staying down and being put in a museum. That was so the majority thought that the statue should have been got down, and that the best place for it now was a museum in a suitably contextualised environment in which the history of Colston's role in the enslavement of Africans could be explained. So that's right. So that they were broadly in tune with the rest of the city. Actually, I mean, nobody came to me and said, "What do you think you're doing?" Except for one person, actually. One person phoned me up and was very upset about it. And he, I have no idea of his ethnicity. It was a telephone call. But I had a lengthy conversation with him about it and explained where we were coming from and why it was important. And I thought my own belief was that it was really important to engage with people who saw the toppling as an act of vandalism and also saw Colston as someone whom they had grown up being told to see as a local hero, and suddenly that had been overturned, and they felt to some extent that their sense of their city was being attacked, and some of that was a kind of defensiveness, and so when I had conversations with people, they would say things like, "Oh, well, look, I know he was a slave trader, but he did good things too. Because my cousin went to Colston School, and she did really well. And I said, I know he did wrong, he did bad things. So the kind of process of trying to make sense of a man who could be both a philanthropist and a slaver, both bad, but apparently do good things, was something I understood that people were kind of struggling with, trying to make sense of, And I didn't actually find very many people saying, I don't care about this. Most of them acknowledged that there was a problem. And most of them would say something like, well, nobody told me. Nobody told me that was the history. And, now I understand.
Was it, in your opinion, mostly people racialized as white, or people racialized in all sorts of ways who are having this, experiencing this ambivalence, this dissidence?
People who are racialized in other ways as well, interestingly. So black people who'd grown up in Bristol too. Not all. Of course, I'm talking about a very small number of people, and maybe some of this ought to be off the record, actually, because I do not want to. I don't want to put into people's mouths things they didn't say.
Would you like me to pause?
Yeah, pause it, and then we can discuss what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. This is the trouble with verbal interviews. You kind of say things, and you think, I didn't phrase that very well.
So to what extent has the report of the We Are Bristol History Commission responded to adequately or to the views or the voices that have been raised in contestation over the statue of Colston?
So the thing I wanted to say was the thing that brought home Colston to me was somebody saying to me, I have to walk past that statue every single day, and that tells me that I am a second-class citizen in Bristol. And that was when I thought, right, we cannot have this statue here. If that's making even a fraction of Bristol citizens feel like that every day of their lives, then they do not feel part of the city. And that is why we have to take action on this statue. That was something that really brought it home to me. This is not a sort of neutral monument. This is something which actually spoke to people every day of their lives. So there was that. Secondly, the History Commission, I think...
To which people did it speak in this way?
primarily Bristol's black citizens, people who came from African Caribbean heritage, and felt that the very fact this had been erected and would continue to sit there before the toppling, that this was a sort of message to them, but Bristol didn't really care about them, that it was much more interested in monumentalising a slave trader. And Bristol's indifference to that, and the fact that Bristol as a city had not noticed that, was what told them that they were really a second-class citizen, that nobody was doing anything about it. So that seemed to me to be an incredibly powerful argument for saying we can't have this. Everyone should feel that they are an equal participant in the city, even though we know that there are all kinds of reasons why that's not always, what actually happens in reality. So the commission. When we were first given our brief, I have to confess, I admit that I thought it would have a much wider brief to transforming the way in which public spaces in the city were understood, utilised and transformed. And I think that was certainly Marvin's intention. The problem was that the issue of the Colston statue became our primary focus, not our only focus. We have actually debated and discussed other aspects of the city's kind of public space as well. But Colston's become the thing. That's what we've become primarily focused on because it's so difficult to make decisions about it. So we have a couple of problems, okay? Marvin Rees set up the commission. It seems quite likely will be wound up when the governance of the city has changed in 2024 because we're switching back to a committee system. There will be no single person who is the kind of repository for decision making in the way that a mayor is. So we have no idea what the future of a commission will be, and I'd quite like us to continue and then to deal with some of those other significant issues of space, geography, identity and narrative that we've been discussing. But I fear we may not. So we are determined that we will at least ensure that the Colston statue is dealt with appropriately and in a way that has responded to the broad wishes of the people of Bristol, but also accurately reflects the complex history involved in the Colston narrative, both in terms of the statue itself, Colston himself, and also the longer term story which is being told around that history. So one of the important things about the Colston toppling is it's a watershed moment in Bristol's history, the moment when Bristol took the world stage, and we kept saying this, look, now is our moment. We now, at long last, we need to do something. We cannot let it drift. We cannot kick the can down the road, or any other metaphor you want to use. This is the time when Bristol confronts its past and does something about it. And it's really important that we find a way to do that. There is a danger that once the commission is disbanded, if it is, that won't happen. But there will be a sort of tendency to say, we've dealt with that, we don't need to do anything more about it. And a lack of recognition that what happened with the Colston statue should be the beginning, not the end, of Bristol coming to terms with its entanglement and history with the transatlantic slavery trade.
Dr. Tincknell, thank you very much for sharing with me your perspective on the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston. Rasmussen is very grateful to you.
I hope you found it useful.
Very much so. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask me or ask about?
Well, first of all, about the kind of transcript, I suppose. Presumably I'll get to see the transcript, will I?
If you would like to, I can share with you a copy.
Yes, I think I would. Yeah, I need to be really careful. You see that there may sometimes you can say things which are not exactly compromising, but they may be inaccurate, or there may be issues which we need to just make sure are not misrepresented. Shall I say?
Of course. When I send you a copy of the transcript, in fact, I'll stop the recording now,